This program is brought to you by thepodcastfactory.com.
Ben Settle, super practical.
I'm not telling people to have a mistress. I'm teaching you, learn the lesson from the people who have a mistress, because there's many business lessons that apply.
Pious.
There's a part in the book of Revelation where Jesus says, I want you either hot or cold. I'm spewing lukewarm churches out. And I think it's a good way to look at your list.
Romantic to his very core.
Once in a while, I'll give my girl a present, like a Snickers bar or something.
And totes tender.
If someone asks you to walk on eggshells, smash the eggshells and let the chips fall wherever they may.
Adored by feminists everywhere.
It takes a strong woman to admit when she's wrong.
Not a judgmental bone in his entire body.
I look at all the free information people give just on Facebook and I go, what a bunch of time hose.
Has a PhD in armchair philosophy.
In the land of dumbasses, the smartass is king.
You'll never meet a more sensitive guy.
If you really care about people, you shame the hell out of them. This is Ben Settle, the bensettle.com podcast. This week, Mr. Jonathan, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that is the power of contrast.
Yes.
Contrast is something I write about in Email Player's Playbook, and as far as like the how-tos of doing it and all that. But today I want to talk about the importance of it and get people at least on the right footing. It's always funny to me how people think that I'm giving away all the best stuff on the podcast or whatever. And in fact, next week I'm doing a Q&A show. And one of the questions I'm not going to answer it because it's kind of a dumb question. But the question is like, why should I buy it for anything if you keep giving me all this stuff away for free? And I'm thinking, okay, well, you can think I'm giving them, but really I'm giving concepts and ideas away. I'm not actually showing anyone how to do it because that's where the paid stuff comes in.
He's not reading, though. Action. All you're doing is building desire.
Well, this is the thing. People, they're not action takers. But so they think that they're getting an education with this stuff, and they are. But without actually knowing how to apply it and having the tools, it's not going to do you much good.
Yeah.
Just not. So I'm sorry to burst anyone's bubble, and all that. Actually, I'm not. I'm always happy to burst someone's bubble. But, that's what it is. But there is value in these. And this one I think will be very valuable for people. It's just one of those things that you're going to have to actually think through. It's not something that you can't learn this from an 18-point checklist. And that's all I'm trying to. That's my whole point. That's all I got to say about that, Jonathan. We can wrap the show up. We're done.
Boom.
No, that's the contrast. See, the last show was 20 minutes. This is 1 minute. That's the contrast I'm talking about. So here's what I want to talk about. The template for contrast, at least for today's lesson, is the movie that I just recently saw. Again, I've seen it. I saw it in the theaters when it came out in like 85 or whatever, is Rocky IV. So I'm sure you've seen Rocky IV at some point in your life, Jonathan. I'm hoping.
Many moons ago.
Yeah. I mean, and by the way, the next Creed movie, apparently, from what I understand, is Rocky training Adonis Creed, Apollo's son, to fight Drago's son. And Drago will be the man who killed Apollo. So
yeah,
that could be an interesting story. So I'll be looking at that with great interest. But Rocky IV is the template, in my opinion, for contrast. The whole script, and Stallone is one of these, he'd be one of Bill Burr's great men. And Bill Burr did that. Schwarzenegger's a great man. Doesn't mean he's not flawed. Doesn't mean he didn't do stupid things, but he's a great man. I mean, you cannot look at Schwarzenegger's life and accomplishments and say that's not a great man. Okay, he did it all. He came here. I don't know how Bill Burr put it, but if you put it in YouTube, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bill Burr, you will get one of the funniest stand-up comedy routines, but also very true about why this great man, Schwarzenegger. Well, I think Stallone was a great man too in a lot of ways. He's just accomplished an awful lot. And he wrote and directed most of these Rocky movies, including Rocky IV. And I think he purposely built in contrast. I don't know this for a fact, but just watching the movie, there's tons of contrast in there to make things stick out more. So, for example, if you haven't seen Rocky IV, I don't know. I guess this is going to be a little weird show for you. But if you've seen it, you remember when Rocky's working out, when he's training to fight Drago, they go to Russia to fight because the fight's in Russia. Now, this is during the Cold War. This is pre-fall of the USSR. So this was when tensions were still very high between the U.S. and the USSR and all that. It wasn't like, Russians, Trump. It was like literally Russians are going to kill us with a nuclear bomb or something, right? It's a totally different time. And when they're training, you'll notice that Drago, he has all the best equipment. He has all the best technology on his side. He's indoors. He's running around a track. He's using a boxing bag, and he's taking steroids.
Fighting
which,
cyborgs.
Yeah, all that stuff. He's doing like cyber. He's hooked up to computer monitors, and they're measuring how hard his punch is. Everything is technology. Everything is science. That's like the modern, boxing of the day. Even though the USSR probably wasn't really all that high tech.
Yeah.
But whatever. In the movie, it was, and everything is high tech. Everything is modern. Everything is very flashy and clean, and that's Drago's workout. While he's working out, they intercut between when Rocky's working out. So you get to see them both working out. Rocky is living in like 4 feet of snow around a cabin. Like literally, it's like he's got no gym or anything. Everything he does is based on nature. Like, so he's pulling Paulie in a sled full of rocks. He's lifting everyone up in a wagon, to train his strength. He's doing all this stuff that's completely primitive. Running up and down the mountains as opposed to running around a track. He's completely primitive in everything, while Drago everything is high tech and new. And it's such an interesting way they do that. The training, because the training montage that's the part everyone likes. I mean, the Rocky movies are very formulaic. It's very templated. Like, you can already tell, but nobody cares because they're such good movies. But there's always a training montage in every movie, and this one I think had one of the longer ones actually. And it's a very, very, I think that was not done on accident. I guarantee you that was very well thought out, because that's what contrast does. And I'll talk more about what contrast does in a little bit, but I'm going to go through the movie some more. The songs that are sang before the fights in these movies. So in the first fight between Apollo and Drago is in America. I think it's even in Las Vegas. I can't remember. And before this fight, they have James Brown, the late James Brown, singing "Living in America." Like, it's as American of a song as you're ever going to get. And he's, Apollo's dancing around Drago and, just trying to troll and taunt him while singing "Living in America." Now, flash forward to the Rocky versus Drago fight in the Soviet Union. During the same time, right before the fight that Rocky has to listen to, just like Drago had to listen to "Living in America," they play the old school Soviet anthem. Two completely different contrasting things that you cannot contrast those. It's even like a dull monotone, thing, as opposed to James Brown, jazzing it up. Two totally very big contrasts. Another piece of contrast. Now, if I seem like I'm Rocky geeking out here, it's because I am. All right. I love these movies. So I'm not going to apologize for that. It is what it is. So in Rocky 3, okay, in the first two Rocky movies, Rocky's basically a brutalizer. He doesn't have a lot of technique. He doesn't have a lot of speed. He doesn't do a lot of jabs. He's just a power. It's all power. He either hits him or he doesn't. If he hits, it's going to hurt a lot. He's mostly going to miss. And Apollo's always dancing around him and jabbing and really fast. Well, in Rocky 3, when Rocky has to fight Mr. T's character, Clubber Lang, Apollo trains Rocky and changes Rocky's fighting style to his. So now Rocky loses like 20 pounds and he's much faster, and he does a lot of he's the exact same fighting style Apollo had in the first two movies. Jabbing a lot of fast jabs, moving quick, and all that. So in Rocky 4, he has to go back to his old school, Rocky does, because obviously Apollo's fighting style doesn't work on Drago. I mean, Drago literally kills him. So he goes back to old school Rocky. So you see that there's this huge contrast between Apollo's fighting style and Rocky's fighting style. From fast and quick to just brutal and slow. And how many punches he can take. There's another part during the Rocky versus Drago fight. It's really interesting because, Drago just beats on Rocky constantly. Beats him. And Rocky finally gets a hit in where he cuts Drago in the eye. And Rocky's trainer says, "Look, see, he's not a machine. He's a man." Because Drago is built up as like this human machine, basically. And he goes, "Look, you cut him. He's a man. You can beat this guy." And then they go to the other corner, and Drago's trainer's yelling at him, and Drago says he's not human. He's like a piece of iron. So totally different contrasting ideas there. Now Rocky is the machine, and Drago is like, now he's the one that's kind of like, whoa, this guy's not like my normal guy that I can beat up. Drago's probably used to just beating the crap out of anyone, but not Rocky. There's obviously a size contrast between Rocky and Drago. Drago's way taller, and in fact, Rocky's reach is like almost non-existent at the beginning of the fight. There's a contrast in motivation. Like Apollo's motivation and Rocky's motivation are totally contrasting in that movie. The reason Apollo fought Drago is because Drago and the Russians were bragging about how great a boxer he was, and Apollo wanted to step in and have an exhibition fight so he could whip this guy. For Apollo, it was pure ego and pride. Well, Rocky didn't stop that fight long enough, and that's why Apollo got killed. I mean, that's basically the gist of what happens. He sees Apollo getting killed. Apollo says, "Don't you stop this fight." He listens to his friend's advice. Apollo gets killed, which is interesting because that became a plot point in Creed later on in 2016's movie. But because that's what motivates Rocky is guilt. He's motivated by guilt for letting this guy die, and then of course his own sense of pride to make right for his friend. But those are contrasting motivations. Of course, you have Russia versus the U.S., which is obviously a big contrast in and of itself. In fact, the main soundtrack song is like about that. And the music's all about contrast. If you listen to that song, there's a lot of contrast in it. It's like body versus spirit, and all that. And then finally, and there's more to this, Jonathan, but I'm already at 10 minutes into there's one more thing about this movie, and then we'll go into the more of what this means. There's a shot, and I may be the only one who actually picked up on this that I know. I'm sure someone else ever has, and I'm sure this was done on purpose. But when Rocky is fighting Drago, there's a shot, and it's very prominent, where you see behind Rocky is a big mural of Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah.
Which to me was very done on purpose. I really believe that Stallone put all this contrast in there on purpose, and it was a very high-selling movie, very well-beloved movie. It's not an easy movie to forget. And considering that was the fourth Rocky movie, that's usually when movies start to kind of peter out, but it was going strong. So that's what here's why contrast is so important. Because I think it's important in any kind of communication. And filmmaking is a form of communication. But I think it's just as important, if not more important and powerful, in persuasive communication, like emails and copywriting, Jonathan, like what we do, podcasting, right? Like you and I are contrasting. Like you're this big hulking figure, and I'm like this skinny little runt, We're very contrasting.
Until you meet us in person.
You're like 7 feet tall, and I'm like 5'4", right? You're Drago, I'm Rocky. There's all this stuff. Okay, there's all this contrast. Your voice is like sexy and smooth, and mine's like raspy and, dirty, whatever. It's like, my voice starts drying up when we get to, after a while. But so it is. So contrast is for one reason, I learned this from my friend Jim Yagi. He's really put this in my head. This was like 10 years ago when I wrote the ad for a course he created about how to do AdWords, because he's very, very good at AdWords. And this. And he was telling me that contrast gets into people's psychology. And I never thought, at that point in my business, I definitely never thought of that. And his example is like when he writes pay-per-click ads, he actually writes them in a way where everything's very contrasting to the point where it almost looks like the lines are different colors, which I know is weird. And it's like hard, like most people don't understand what I'm saying there. But if you ever learn from Jim Yagi, you'll know what I'm talking about. He actually very specifically inserts contrast into his AdWords ads. And it's very fascinating. And he uses contrast, and it gets into people's psychology. It also makes things very easy to remember. For example, there was a headline, how a bald-headed barber saved my hair, or something like that. And there was another headline, how to win at the races by picking losers. Right? So it's like complete contrast. That stuff just sticks in your head. That's why the whole like how skinny guy became big or whatever sticks in your head. One of my best headlines I ever wrote, most successful, was how a skinny Barney Fife cop, can take down bigger and badder fighters without even drawing his gun. It was something like that. I can't remember. It was for this product I wrote many years ago. But there was contrast embedded within that headline. And I try to do that in all my headlines now, or at least as many as where it makes sense. Contrast is inherently interesting. It's just not boring. If you want to bore somebody, you're never going to make a sale. By using a lot of contrast, you simply won't bore anybody. It's just what it is, because it's constantly contrast. It's lighting your psychology up. It's doing something to your neurons. I don't know what, but it definitely does something. It obviously gets a lot of attention. Any type of contrasting idea or contrasting layout, it will get attention, and which is important, obviously, if you don't get it. That's the whole point of the headlines like that. Easily to notice things that are contrasting. There's the late great Gary Halbert was big on like, everyone listens. If you haven't been to thegaryhalbertletter.com, I highly recommend it. His entire site, it was so different because it's yellow. His background is yellow. It's not white. It's not like black on white like we do, like most of us do. He used yellow background, because he said black on yellow has the most contrast and it's the easiest to read. So that's something to think about. And it is kind of interesting how that works out and how few of us actually use yellow backgrounds, even though we know this. So be it. But it's hard to miss. It's really hard to miss and ignore anything that's contrasting, especially the bigger the spread of contrasting ideas and the more outrageous it is, the harder it is to miss. And then finally, when you do contrast right, you can say more without saying as much. It's kind of like old school Bible scholars will call it figures of speech in the Bible, where you could say an awful lot and very little without saying much at all. Like what might take somebody a page, you can say in like 2 sentences, because the contrast does all the work for you. It's hard to explain what that means without you actually looking at it, but I try to do it in my emails all the time. I try to do it in my sales letters all the time. I try to do it in my blog posts all the time. I even, Jonathan, try to do it in my podcasts all the time. And
White Man's Review of Black Panther?
Exactly. White Man's Review of Black Panther. Doesn't that have more contrast than Black Man's View of Black Panther? Like it wouldn't, yeah. It doesn't really it doesn't stand out. But when you put things that contrast together, it sticks out. When I walk around a small town like where I'm at with Stephanie, and she's brown and I'm white, don't think for a minute people don't notice that. Because, this is an almost all white town, basically. It's contrast. It stands out. I think it's amusing and fun, actually. She's like, everyone's staring at me. Well, that's the cost. That's the cost of being brown, is what I tell her.
You got to pay the price.
So that's the cost of being brown. So anyway, that's what I'm talking about contrast. Contrast is good. Use it, abuse it. It's something I teach in more depth in other places, but that should be enough, John. Really, that's enough for people to get started on. It really, you can take this information and profit from it, and I hope people do, and so be it. Next week, Jonathan, we're going to I'm reaching into the sack of questions, and I'm going to grab 5 questions that I think that reflect the questions other people have asked. So it's not like I'm just one-on-one answering a question only one person cares about. We're going to get into things like the danger of groupthink and following trends, and how to do subscription-based podcasts. We're going to talk about, because even though you and I are the last person to really answer that question, we're also the most qualified, like how to put together a subscription-based podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about the whole villains ideology, which, I've taken to kind of a cartoon level, but there's a lot to it, like villains versus heroes and all that. Anyway, I got some more questions we'll go through, but that'll be next week.
God, that sack must be big. Just questions keep popping out of it. So that is a wrap for another bensettle.com podcast. We will be back next time.
You've been listening to the bensettle.com podcast. To download yourself a free issue of Ben's prestigious $97 per month email players newsletter, which is going to show you 24 ways to write emails people eagerly read, click, and buy from, head on over to www.bensettle.com. Well, off you go. You know it makes sense.
This is the podcastfactory.com.